according to this. Now, what Mill is going to do, Mill is actually going to refine this argument. He makes qualitative distinctions. And unsurprisingly, he's going to distinguish between so-called higher pleasures versus, and some of you did the homework question on this. Higher pleasures he would refer to as when he talks of higher pleasures, he is talking about intellectual and or psychological pleasures. Now you might notice I put intellectual this way, because oftentimes when we talk about intellectual pleasures, students get the wrong idea. We're not just talking about reading books. We are not just talking about going to the opera. Including in intellectual pleasures, Mill actually included all the kinds of things that Epicurus, the ancient Greek, would have included. In fact, if you read Mill in his own words, take a guess who he actually appeals to. He appeals to the Epicurean account of hedonism. He contends that among the highest pleasures, in fact, higher learning is part of cultivating a person, although it's not the only intellectual pleasure. Like the Epicureans, he believed that friendship was also among the higher pleasures. Now, there are also practical reasons for preferring the higher pleasures. Because if you do appreciate the higher pleasures, these are the kind of pleasures that are more enduring. Because the body will eventually what? Your body will fail you at some point. And this is why, in the long run, the physical pleasures are going to be ones that will outrun their usefulness for you at some point. This is why when I'm an old fart, I'm getting there, by the way, getting closer to that point. But it would probably be good of me to have hobbies. And I do have some, so I'm acting like I don't have any. But it's good to have hobbies that will rely on a wide range of my abilities. Because there's certain things that I might be able to do now that I might be able to do less so in the future. And by the way, people who play, very physically intensive sports and enjoy them very much find this out at some point. At some point, your football life will be over. Simply because at a certain age, your body's not going to be able to hold up. That's just the way it goes. This is why some of these finesse sports that are not as physically punishing might in the long run be more in your interest. Tennis, badminton, things of this nature. Not that you can't get tennis elbow. But yeah, these are sports that you can actually play longer into, into your later ages and so forth. But yeah, the intellect, give me 30 more seconds. Now, when he's talking about the lower pleasures, what's he talking about? It's what I was calling the visceral pleasures before. The ones that feel really, really good physically. They're oftentimes short-lived pleasures. They oftentimes do not exercise your higher faculties. These are among the reasons why Mill contends the higher pleasures are intrinsically better, whether you know it or not. Because to cultivate your mind actually opens you up to more what? This is not clearly mentioned in the book. It actually opens you up to more possibilities. Because people who appreciate the higher pleasures will still actually probably appreciate what too? The lower pleasures. It's just they'll have a wider range of possibilities for enjoyment. This is why I tell my son, it is probably good for you to enjoy reading. It's also good for you to enjoy this, that, and the other thing. Because not only will video games eventually rot your brain, But at some point, you will probably think, why the hell did I spend so much of my teenage years playing video games? Because after all, and I don't want to sound too vulgar here, but when he finally decides he might want to enter the dating world, the fact that you're really, really good at first-person shooter games and Mario Brothers and so forth isn't likely to get you a date. However, maybe being able to drop some names of some literary figures and philosophers might be able to impress somebody with your... You might not be a big manly man, but guess what? You can pretend to be an intellectual, and that sometimes does what? That sometimes impresses people. Yeah. You also kind of show your range. And by the way, people who have this kind of range are also likely to have more what in the long run? Not just possibilities, but more opportunities. Those kind of correlates, I understand. But more overall opportunities. Now, he also argued this. People who have had their higher faculties cultivated are also more likely to be moral. Does anyone know why? This is subtle. People who appreciate the higher pleasures are also more likely to be moral. I'll give you the quick answer. People who read literature, I mean great works of literature, that deal with the human condition are more likely to feel genuine empathy for other people. Not just selfish empathy, but genuine empathy. This is why one contemporary philosopher who died pretty recently, and this is kind of a paraphrase from him, would contend that the likes of Charles Dickens have done more for people's moral consciousness than any room full of Kantians have. Because remember, Kantian philosophy is all abstract, and it makes morality abstract. But when you read great works of literature that deal with the human condition, you actually come to put yourself where? In those people's shoes. You can start to sympathize with them. Now, of course, Kant would say sympathy is not really moral. However, Mill would say that it is. Because whenever you feel sympathy for other human beings, you're not just appreciating your own humanity. You're appreciating our collective humanity. He didn't quite use those words, but that's his idea. Now, he believed that that was as close as we could come to become really altruistic. But he believed that the person whose higher faculties were exercised, people who appreciated the higher pleasures, were more likely to have altruistic sentiments. That is, genuine concern for people other than what? Themselves. Yeah, other than themselves. Oh, Mr. Shepard, you had a question. Sorry, I wanted to finish this first.
The question was essentially, so, with regards to higher and lower functions, in the long term, I would get more pleasure from say, building and painting a model than I would playing baseball for 2 years.
That's not, and to clarify on that example, partly because that is, if that's something that you take a good bit of pleasure in, and by the way, does it take skill to build models and things? Yeah, not that it doesn't take skill to play baseball, but your baseball life will not go on when? It will not go on indefinitely, most likely. Now, I'm not knocking baseball, I have to admit. I do like to watch baseball from time to time, which might actually be a knock against me, because I was making fun of whom before? I was making fun of people who can watch a car go around a track in the same direction for 3 hours. But some people would say, how is that any different from watching Thursday night football? How is that any different from watching a baseball game? And you know what? Objectively speaking, I really don't have a leg to stand on there. I mean, I might make something up and talk about the strategy that goes into winning baseball, or the strategy that goes into game planning against a football opponent. But keep in mind, someone who's into NASCAR would likely what? They could give me the same kind of, well, this takes strategy too, man. Even though you conceited ass can't see it. In other words, judging other people's pleasures as lower than your own would, just seem to be merely conceited from some people's standpoint. And you know what? To some extent, that may be true. But to defend Mill just a tiny little bit, Mill does also suggest that the higher pleasures, as he's calling them, do take a little bit more work to cultivate. And that's one of the reasons why many people, when given the choice between higher pleasures and lower pleasures, will pick what? They'll pick lower. And by the way, even those of us who know both, I would argue with him, sometimes choose the lower over the higher. Does anyone know why? I don't do it all the time. But admittedly, I generally agree with Mill that the higher pleasures are more valuable and more enjoyable in the long run. But there are times when I will choose on a momentary basis the lower pleasures over the higher. And there's a couple reasons for that. Because the lower pleasures feel good. I'm a human being. You're human beings. I don't care how much you enjoy the opera. But sometimes just sitting down and watching a dumb movie and vegging is fun too. Am I right? That's sometimes fun too. I mean, after all, I hate those awful Adam Sandler comedies. But we do sometimes have fun having family time making fun of those kind of movies. You know what I'm talking about? About how stupid can, was it Grown Ups too? Like, boy, what kind of 11-year-olds find this to be really funny? We find it funny to mock it. But you know what? I mean, I guess mocking something is kind of engaging in sort of the least common denominator, but it's fun. I enjoy that. And by the way, the intellectual pleasures are sometimes just so damn tiring. You know what I'm talking about? They're tiring. At the end of the day, after doing intellectual work, sometimes you just want to vegetate. So yeah, these are some reasons why people who know both might sometimes aim low. Because after all, that's part of me too. If it weren't part of me, I wouldn't be what? I wouldn't be a human animal. Remember, I'm human, but I'm also a human animal. And that's operative here.
45.
45, thanks. Well, I'm going to wrap up one little thing here. Now, Mr. Shepard asked an important question. John Stuart Mill is also a very important figure in our political ideologies. He wrote a fabulous essay called On Liberty. It's really worth checking out. Now, Mill understood that there was a potential conflict between his championship of liberty and his utilitarianism. Now, folks, keep in mind, if you're a strict utilitarian, you believe that what is always the right thing to do will be the thing that will produce the best actual outcomes. Now, you'll notice that some people might say that restricting certain kinds of freedoms will make more people happy. Therefore, we should restrict these freedoms over here. You might also hear some people saying that if we would make a lot more people happy if we were just to ban these particular books that make a wide segment of the population unhappy. And you know what? Strictly speaking, if those would have more pleasurable results for people, you'd have to say it was the right thing to do. Well, what Mill suggests is, even if certain people are made happy by certain restrictions on liberty, that in the long run, no one is actually better off by restricting liberty. Because people who have their liberties maximized, even though other people exercising their liberty is sometimes what for us?
Detrimental.
Yeah, sometimes unpleasant. In the long run, a free society is a happier society. Now there's a good slippery slope reason why he also argues this position. I love conversations about so-called free speech. Everybody's for free speech until certain people who they don't like are saying things that they don't like. And then they're saying, we shouldn't allow them to do this because it upsets veterans, or it upsets conservatives, or it upsets liberals. In other words, everybody claims they're for free speech, but yet they want to ban somebody's free expression. Now, Mill recognizes that he says, number one, he says, does it actually do any real harm for somebody to express ideas that you don't like? He does not believe that it creates genuine harm. Genuine harm would be if I whacked you across the face with my religious beliefs. But my merely saying my religious beliefs doesn't really hurt you. As a matter of fact, Mill would say if people's viewpoints offend you sometimes, good. Because sometimes being offended is required for a kind of growth that a lot of people don't really appreciate on the surface. I'm talking about intellectual growth. Because so many people are intellectually illiterate. They tend to just believe whatever they are trained to believe. And then when they hear something that goes against what they've been trained to believe, they get all upset like baby snowflakes. Of course, that's the irony here. A lot of people who are called snowflakes are actually being called snowflakes by other snowflakes. How many of you have noticed this? Yeah, Donald Trump is probably the biggest snowflake on the planet. He can't take being criticized. And by the way, do a bunch of football players not standing for the pledge really hurt anybody? Isn't it a nicer way to protest by getting in people's face that way rather than doing what?
Then rioting and looting?
Yeah, would you prefer if he pulled a Che Guevara?
I would rather...
Would you prefer that they pull a Weather Underground movement? By the way, the Weathermen, they placed a bomb at the Capitol. How many of you know about this? They placed a bomb at the Capitol. This is why they weren't terrorists, because guess what they did ahead of time?
Told people.
Yeah, they said, we placed a bomb in the Capitol. And of course, they did it to make a political point. They were doing it in part to protest the war. They were also doing it in order to protest against systematic racism. But guess what? People are still protesting against. But yeah, my question is, does somebody exercising free speech, it might upset you, but the aim is actually to upset you. Because you can't change your mind or meaningfully think something through unless somebody slapped you alongside the head to get your attention. Does that make sense? And by the way, how mature is a person who can't even listen to alternative points of view? I'm making Mill's point here. He understands that sometimes people will be made unhappy. But in the long run, a free society, even if it means temporary psychological discomfort, really means a long-term better society. Because, by the way, people who are used to hearing one another out in a mature way actually can handle dialogue. And by the way, you only treat other people with actual respect if you're willing to, to actually listen to them. Have a stellar one.